We have today two wonderful guests. We have Matthew Zacharias with us from Georgetown University, as well as the Honorable Michael Vickers. So thank you both again for coming. Matthew, can you please share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yep. So I grew up in Arizona and had a brother who was a Marine. 9/11 happened, and it really inspired me to want to go be a Marine after watching my brother rise to that need for the United States. So I did. I later became an enlisted infantry Marine, and then I got out of the Marine Corps, pursued other things, entrepreneurial endeavors, as well as my undergraduate. And I felt that call, that tug, and I came back. So I came back as an officer, and now I'm currently working at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab in wargaming capacity. So
fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Vickers, can you please share with us about your background? So a little bit about your experience and some of your memorable or most memorable experiences.
So I spent about half of my career on the operational side in the Army Special Forces and the CIA as an operations officer, and then in the latter part of my career as a national security policymaker and intelligence community leader. I became a Special Forces soldier at age 20 in 1974 after training, and then became a Special Forces officer, and then went to the CIA. And then after 9/11 became Assistant Secretary into the George W. Bush administration, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Low Intensity Conflict, and Interdependent Capabilities. So in addition to our Special Operations Forces and all forms of irregular warfare, I had policy oversight of all the Department of Defense's operational capabilities, from nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy to space, missile defense, cyber, down to the transformation and defense planning guidance of our military services. And then my final assignment was as Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, where I oversaw all the defense intelligence enterprise, National Security Agency, National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, who did I leave off? National Reconnaissance Office, and then the intelligence services of the combatant commands and military services. Most memorable events of my career, probably the most memorable, and I talk about this in my memoir, was when I was in the CIA, kind of at the culmination of the operational phase, and I was the Afghanistan Covert Action Program Officer in CIA and the Director of Operations in the mid-1980s, when we changed our strategy to try to defeat the Soviets and eject them out of Afghanistan, and it turned out to be successful. And then as a policymaker, two other memorable events. During the late George W. Bush administration, I was asked with CIA to develop a strategy to take away al-Qa'ida's new sanctuary in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. And then I had the good fortune to help plan and do the policy for the raid that killed Osama bin Laden.
Oh, wow. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. And what are some lessons learned throughout your career, with particular focus on intelligence covert actions and parallels that apply to those?
So some of lessons learned are in the broader strategy area, but they certainly apply to covert action and intelligence, particularly the clandestine collection of intelligence. And one of them that I learned from the late Cold War through the War on Terror is that having the strategic initiative and offensive strategies generally outperform purely defensive ones. And again, generally more risk-taking produces better results than less. And this is true for how we used our submarines in the late Cold War, how we used deep attack to unhinge Soviet strategy, including through the use of missiles, but also how we achieved escalation dominance over al-Qaida and other jihadists with our drone campaigns. So when we took the fight to them, we did quite well. When we didn't do so well. And that's also true in intelligence collection, when we learned that we could operate in Moscow, for example. It wasn't perfect, but we did rather well in the late Cold War and against al-Qaida as well. Covert action, the most important part of covert action is the noun part rather than the adjective. It's the action that counts. You actually have to achieve the effect. And so it's not surprising that some of our most successful programs are the largest because you get scale and speed. So Afghanistan in the 1980s, our counterterrorism efforts more recently have been among the most successful programs. And others that never really got off the ground well tend not to do as well. The other important point about covert action is that it's got to be broadly consistent with American foreign policy. And most programs are, but when they're not, you can run into trouble when they're disclosed, as they inevitably are. So, you want we have representatives in Congress, committees in the House and Senate who oversee these. But when they're disclosed, you'd like the American people to say, okay, I see why my government's doing that. I understand it needed to be secret, but this is kind of what I'd expect them to do and want them to do rather than what are these people doing. So.
Makes sense. Thank you for sharing.
Well, no, I just actually wanted to follow up on your memoir. Some of your so any particular stories in there that I know you talked about your more memorable points, but anything in the memoir that you maybe would like to highlight the most fun to write, or maybe something you wish you'd put in there? Thinking of just the book here.
So it was a challenge in writing, in a sense, one kind of writing about yourself and the events you participated in, a different writing experience than doing a PhD dissertation, for example. And so my wife was constantly on me to make sure I told stories to illustrate things, show, don't tell, as she would say to me over and over. So I have stories in there about one of my early parachute jumps ending up at the top of it when they miscalculated where to drop us over the drop zone in North Carolina, ending up at the top of an 80-foot tree and having to figure out a way down, or in free fall having a rucksack that was not packed properly and caused me to go into a spin. And so I learned some things early on from some near-death experiences, I guess. But one story was soon after I joined CIA, a crisis developed in Grenada, and I was sent as one of the first 3 guys on the ground in Grenada for the invasion in 1983 with our Special Operations Forces. And I didn't know I was going to Grenada when I was told to pack for 2 weeks and come into CIA headquarters on a Sunday. So I packed a lot of suits and ties, thinking I was going to some base or embassy. And when they told me, they gave me a weapon, a bag full of tens of thousands of dollars of cash and satellite communications. I had a Ralph Lauren polo shirt and some linen pants and some loafers, and that's how I went into combat. And then we didn't have a vehicle the first day, so we had to hotwire an East German construction truck, a 10-ton truck that was on the airfield, and so you have to adapt to situations sometimes. And next day, CIA flew in a Suzuki Jeep for us, which was very nice. Just purchased right away, but took them a day. And so that's some of the stories. One of the unusual missions I had during the Cold War was a few of us in the Special Forces and SEALs were trained to deliver a backpack nuclear weapon in the event of major war into Eastern Europe to blow up a big tunnel or a major bridge or something to stop the Soviet reinforcing forces because they had a 3-to-1 numerical advantage over us. And so learned to skydive with one of those things, and it's an interesting experience.
Sounds like a lot of improvising on the ground, fast learning.
Yeah.
Oh, can't wait to pick up the book, sir. And so, Matt, notice you've got a lot of tabs there. So, wanted to see, or I guess hear, if anything that you've, found in his memoir, any sort of insights for anything that you're studying at Georgetown, or maybe your experience in wargaming. Maybe you can tell us about how that's impacted your efforts there.
Yeah, so like reading the book, a lot of these tabs are personal things. It's me looking at lessons and things like you described, getting stuck in a tree or the improvising that you had to do in order to get through situations. Coming from a Marine infantry background, You know, maybe not an 80-foot tree, but I've certainly had my fair share of taking a squad of infantry Marines and saying, "Nope, that didn't work. Time to figure out what our way forward is." So a lot of those tabs are personal, kind of just little marks in there of parallels and things that I can relate to. But some of the ones in there, particularly towards the end of your book, where you highlighted some of the strategy of the way forward, I particularly wanted to be able to reference those. I like to mark up books so that when I'm writing, when I'm going back, whether that's for purposes at work or whether it's at Georgetown, I go to those tabs and I've got something to reference. One of the things that you just mentioned was about strategic initiative, and I hear a lot of throwing around of the phrase strategic ambiguity today. I wouldn't argue against it per se, but I do think that there's a balance to be had. And so I'd be interested to know, after reading the book, and I think you've got, I think it was 6 different kind of things to work towards in terms of a strategy going forward, like knowing the type of fight we get into and things like that. So it sounds more like I would think myself, and as an infantry guy, when I was enlisted, similar to you, you find a way or make one. And so I struggle a little bit with the strategic ambiguity bit, but I'd be interested to know what you think in terms of finding the right balance for that. Is there something to be said for strategic ambiguity? Is it a timing thing? Is it almost always better to take that initiative?
Yeah, so great question, Matt. So strategic ambiguity is not my phrase. You know, the origins of it, as I understand it, kind of come from our policy toward Taiwan and a potential PRC Taiwan conflict, which is what the ultimate U.S. position will be depends on the circumstances. We don't want Taiwan taken by force, but on the other hand, if Taiwan were to do something that violated the One China policy and triggered an invasion, then we might not react the same way. And that's been U.S. policy for decades. We'll see in the end if it were a wise policy or not. But, you know, it may be important in that one case because of the One China policy that we've had since the Nixon administration, across administrations. But for deterrence to work, you want more clarity than ambiguity about what the cost might be of an adversary doing something. And that's an area where we've kind of fallen down or so in the past decade. And particularly for this audience in cyberspace, deterrence is much tougher. And so issues like, for example, if you have non-state actors operating on the territory of a great power rival but attacking you in various ways, how much is the government in that country that's kind of, at least tacitly, allowing them to operate responsible for that? And, or is it an active state, even though if it's done by non-state actors? So there are a number of areas where clarity helps.
Right.
Well, I think in cyberspace too, it's there's this sense of ambiguity naturally that occurs within the realm. So I think it's a significant challenge for folks in the cyber field as well as those complementing, whether it be traditional intelligence collection or otherwise. I think there's this uncovering or this trying to uncover that ambiguity in this space, especially with cyber. So
yeah, so that's a different point. Rather than a policy of ambiguity or strategic ambiguity, intelligence officers often have to deal with imperfect information, and so have to make judgments about that. And one of the things CIA looks for in operations officers is operationally, they'd be able to handle kind of unstructured situations where you have to adapt. And so that tolerance for ambiguity, but there it's more tactical ambiguity and improvising, as you were talking about earlier. And then you referenced one other point that I'd like to maybe highlight, which is one of the things I felt I really should do in the memoir was, rather than just writing about what I saw over 40 years, I added a chapter that's a little unusual for a memoir, which is forward-looking for the next 20 years, about the challenges we face from principally China, but also Russia and others, and what we might do about that. And the reason I did that was, one, I was involved in policy not too long ago, but second, the reasons I wrote the book, one was for history, and the other was to share what I could about intelligence and covert action, of course cleared by the government, with my fellow citizens. But I also wanted to provide lessons and also a blueprint as much as I could for the next generation who are going to wage this fight. It's not going to be me. And so, you know, if we have a new Cold War now that may last decades, I wanted to give them at least, you know, what I thought we might do as we begin this period.
Given your plethora of experiences, but given your experience, how do you see intelligence evolving? Has it evolved from 10, 15, 20 years ago to where you see it today, to where you're seeing it go in the future, especially given keeping in mind all of the technological innovation and advancements that's occurring, for example, AI, machine learning, etc. CCTV cameras that are on every street corner. Covert action will be a lot more difficult under those circumstances, but maybe in other cases it might be easier. So where do you see that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, one, the strategic context evolved. So 10 to 15 years ago, we were very focused on al-Qa'ida and its allies, although we were still collecting and analyzing against China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Mexican drug cartels and others. But the balance has certainly shifted as the terrorist threat has been a bit diminished, and or more than a bit in some cases, and the China and Russia threat and even Iran has increased. And then, as you mentioned, besides this return to great power competition, there's this revolution in technology going on. So, you know, cyber's been a feature of the intelligence environment for better part of 2 decades now, but the number of countries that have some cyber capabilities, and by that I mean some offensive capabilities, even if they're rudimentary, because most have some form of cybersecurity, has doubled and then doubled again in the past decade or so. And so now it encompasses half the world. So there's a lot more actors out there than people think. Not all that sophisticated, but capable of doing some things in their areas. And then, you know, some of the big technologies that are going to matter are artificial intelligence, which can both be a help and a hindrance. It will enable offensive cyber, but it'll help the defense as well. It'll, on the military side, it'll enable more autonomous operations and even planning. And for information influence, you know, we now have these deep fakes that are very sophisticated and hard to detect. And so it's made information, and you can, and with generative AI, you can you know, you have the distribution mechanism, but also the scale to do this stuff very rapidly and widely. So it's a very different information environment than we had in the last Cold War, where when the Soviets wanted to blame us for AIDS or blame us for this, you know, they had to put things in newspapers or others, and now you can get it all over the world very, very quickly. On the operational side, you referred to cameras. So, you know, in the Cold War, we developed what we call Moscow rules, how to operate under 24/7 intense physical surveillance and still be able to communicate with an agent or pass secrets back and forth or other things of operational use. And now we have what we call Beijing rules. Beijing is the most wired city in the world now, cameras everywhere, and that being fed into information processors that can analyze people's pattern of life, much as we would do with a terrorist or someone else. But if you're out of that pattern, you really stick out very quickly. So you have to learn new tradecraft of how to be able to operate in that kind of, you're watched all the time, technically, not just by people. And so there's that. And then, as you mentioned, covert action has to adapt to this environment, both in the technical challenges that create more transparency, but all this new information influence environment, and not only how to defend against it, but how to use it for our own purposes. So, you know, just everything has gone more high tech.
Yeah, I could see the challenge involved in that. And one more thought that maybe both of you be happy to hear both of your thoughts on it: the role of open source intelligence. So the role of open source intelligence, it wasn't as prominent 20 years ago or more so. Today, all of us can post information online. We can read that information online. You have the open source enterprise with the CIA that focuses on that particular area. Can you share maybe a little bit about the evolution of that and acceptance of open source intelligence as intelligence?
Sure. So when I was a CIA officer, we had an organization called the Foreign Broadcast Information Service that a bunch of linguists who read the foreign press and translated it every day. So we had news from around the world. Today, open source is vastly different. You have all this information in the digital space, which poses challenges for cover about a person's history, just from an operational sense as an intelligence officer. But with this competition in technology with China, this tech arms race in AI and quantum computing and synthetic biology, a lot of that is conducted semi in the open. Governments may have their secrets, but a lot of the way you do science and things is papers and sharing, and so there's a lot more that's available. Open source is also used for, in operational context, because you can learn more about where someone is in the open than you could in the past, and that technology has dramatically advanced. The one thing that I would say is some people believe two things. One, that you don't really need to steal secrets anymore, that it's out there in the open. That's patently not true. There's still things governments protect about their nuclear weapons, about their top leadership intentions that our intelligence community and others, want to know. And so good old-fashioned spying, espionage, but also signals intelligence and others, and knowing things about what's going on in space or cyberspace, that's not going away with open source. And then some others have suggested that this more empowered discipline, we need an open source agency, another agency in our intelligence community. And because everybody uses it for their own purpose, I don't think it would be wise to centralize it in that way, because you still then need, you need collectors, but you need analysts, and are they, you want to do all source analysis where you're integrating open and secret stuff, and so I just don't know that an agency would be a wise organizational decision. We've had a tendency to just create more and more organizations. At some point you want to consolidate them a little bit.
Well, and I think to that effect too, another thing that for me looking at going into the field is looking at, okay, well, as a potential person that could go into operations or into analysis, there's an intent that I need to have, and that the government also needs to meet on training people to do it well. I think if you're going to receive or be able to access all this open source information, we just talked about misinformation and disinformation. Some of that open source might not be true, and it might not be true on purpose.
Definitely.
And if we don't train analysts or collectors to know what they're looking at, which is becoming increasingly challenging, I think that's something that's going to be, at least on the training side, I mean, I can't speak for any of the intelligence agencies, but I think that's going to have to be something that's training. I mean, we try to do it, DOD and the Marine Corps specifically, right? We have annual training, and people get told, like, hey, this is what to look for. These are your indicators. But by and large, if someone takes on the responsibility of looking at open source and then using it, how we use it, it's going to be a challenge I think we're going to have to look at.
Yeah, and I would say that's a very good point, and I would add to that in general, our officers, who are starting out now and looking forward over the next couple of decades, will have to be a lot more technologically savvy in a way than we had to be.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up with that. To your point, can you speak to the fusion of OSINT and government intelligence? I mean, where it was during your time, and then kind of where we are now?
Yeah, it's more really an expansion and a change in the technology. As I mentioned before, it was, back when I was in the Cold War, it was more translating foreign press, and now it's, you know, so many different sources, and most of them online. And so it's just another source of intelligence. In some areas, it may be a leading one, because, you know, economic intelligence or other things that may be secrets can help you a little bit, but it's really analyzing the volume of data that's the critical challenge. And in other cases, not so much. You know, if you're really looking for the secrets, you're probably not going to find it. And then sorting out what's real and not, you know, is still a challenge for, you know, any intelligence, but it's probably more true in the open source realm than in the secret realm.
Yeah. So maybe I can kind of close this out here with, on that note, about maybe advice you have for the next generation of intelligence professionals.
Yeah, so I think public service is a really real noble calling. And so, you know, you ask why people would, very, very talented people would join the military or the intelligence community and do it for a career. It's because the psychic rewards are so great of doing something bigger than yourselves and working with like-minded people and working on hard problems that matter to our fellow citizens. And that remains as true today as when I first joined. Perhaps because I was going into the Special Forces and wanted to go into the CIA, and perhaps also because I saw too many James Bond movies as a kid, I thought that really mastering a lot of skills was important to being a future leader. And early in my Army career, they talked to us about leadership, about informal leadership versus formal. You know, the formal ones are you have this position and you have authorities to mete out rewards or punishment. But the informal ones was, you know, sort of right up my alley, which was kind of expert power. You know, who do you turn to when you've got a problem? Well, you know, if you're doing brain surgery, you probably ought to turn to someone really good in brain surgery. And that really resonates with Special Forces and some of the intelligence positions that I later had. And then also, who are the natural leaders in a group? You know, kind of if you could select your leader, who do you want to listen to? Not just because they're the expert, but because they have other qualities. Kind of resonated as well. I found in my career, leading up was more important to my success than actually leading down, you know, and that's persuading superiors, from president to directors of CIA to secretaries of defense, not the same as commanding troops. You know, it takes a different set of skills. The standard idea that really get good at something that you love, and you know, it's hard to we tell people follow their passions, but you got to be good at your passions. I wanted to be a quarterback and a baseball player, and when I found out that wasn't happening after high school, I decided to become a Green Beret. But when you find that and you're good at it, you know, that expertise that you develop makes a contribution, but it also lays the foundation for later. And then at some point you really need to broaden and take on more responsibilities. And so I was fortunate later in my career to work on the problem of the rise of China and nuclear strategy and how war might change over 30 years, and that helped prepare me for in the interregnum between my operational career and policy career for the challenges I faced when I was a more senior government official. So, you know, those would be some of the advice I would give. But as I said, I would just start with it's a very noble calling, and if you have the passion for it and you're good at it, I certainly encourage people to do it.
So I teach students who are, a number of them, very interested in joining the CIA or NGA or NSA, any of the intel agencies. A lot of their questions revolve around how can they better prepare themselves as graduate students to position themselves to be prime candidates. Is that something that you can share? What is they can do? Maybe study additional languages, travel more, any kind of experience, maybe working with think tanks or elsewhere. That could help them better position themselves for that role, both on the analyst side and the ops side.
Yeah, so the agencies are different in what they look for, and And even within CIA, depending on what we look for in an analyst versus an operations officer, or a support officer, or a science and tech officer are different again. But generally, doing well in school is kind of a starter. And so if you didn't do so well as early undergraduate years, that's okay. America's the land of second and third chances. Pick yourself up and do well going forward. And there are plenty of people who've risen to the top of the CIA, just like at the top of the military, who might have been C students early on, but were smart, and then later corrected that. So that's one. And then for some, overseas living experience on the operational side is valuable. Foreign languages are very valuable. But it also comes down to the traits you need to be an operations officer, the emotional intelligence, the confidence to try to persuade someone to give us their secrets. It's not an easy thing to ask. And, so you have to have a sort of a tolerance for when you're going to be rejected and not get dejected by being rejected, but also knowing when to ask. And then for analysts, the ability to communicate orally and in writing very well, so-called elevator speech, et cetera. But also just a broad curiosity and then logic to follow the evidence where it leads. And that's helpful for anybody, but it's particularly important for a good analyst. One, to learn lots of things because you never know what you're going to discover, but then when you're answering a question, really map the evidence to that and communicate it well. And so, those are two examples. I could give more from NGA and NSA and others, but they're great careers.
Thank you for answering that. It's going to help a lot of folks out there who are looking to apply. So thank you both, Matthew and Dr. Vickers, for joining us today. We hope to have you back at the show in the future. And thank you again, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.